Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the Literaturia podcast. I am your host, Donald Pan. In the last episode, we talked about the famous play Macbeth, a marvelous play written by the one and only William Shakespeare. Well, today, let us discuss another one of his well-known, well-written works that seems very much ahead of its time, Othello. Together with me today, we were supposed to have Professor Leah S. Marcus from Vanderbilt University for some analysis, but unfortunately, due to the increasing danger of the Omicron variant, we were only able to get a statement from her. But we also have Professor Millicent Bell, the late Professor Millicent Bell, Professor of English Emerita at Boston University, with one of her statements as well. We have done some extensive research into this topic to provide you, our audience, with only the best analysis and insights that will have you admiring Shakespeare's works more than ever. Today we will be asking ourselves the core question, is Othello a racist play or a play about race? This age-old question is one without one single absolute correct answer, and its debatable enigma is exactly our topic today. Now, without further ado, let's get right into the show. With the data that we have collected and the analyses that we took into account, at the Literaturia podcast, our opinion on this matter is that Othello is not a play that expresses racist undertones, nor does it promote discriminatory themes, therefore not making it a racist play. It is a story that highlights the subconscious implications of race in day-to-day Venetian life, calling attention to the discriminatory concepts that corrupt people around them. Othello's sense of identity, formed from both society's existing notions and the actions of people surrounding him, help the reader understand how the problem of race gives rise to conflicts and is a major factor in Shakespeare's classic Venetian tragedy. Othello is one of the most arguably influential and imaginative tragedies composed by William Shakespeare. Placing an African-American slave-turned general into a full white setting shows us exactly what the impacts of society on individual psyches are. This revolutionizes the way that society was portrayed at the time, and the idea of racism was explicitly shown. Like a drop of blood on yellow bedsheets, or a drip of blue paint on a white drywall, or a splotch of black paint on an empty canvas. The contrast that we see here of racism in a society is highlighted to such a degree that it would be impossible to not think of the play as racist at first. Shakespeare refers to Othello through Iago as an old black ram, a Barbary horse, one who uses foul charms, drugs, and minerals, but most of all, a Moor. The word Moor could just be seen as a reference to dark-skinned individuals used by Christian Europeans to name the Muslims of the Iberian Peninsula, Malta, and Sicily. However, our extensive research has found out that there is an older meaning here, and Shakespeare is not one to throw words around randomly. The word used in Othello is definitely deliberate. In the older days, a black Moor would refer to one who isn't just black in skin color, but quote-unquote black in personality at the time. By calling someone a Moor, it is tantamount to referring them in a derogatory, disparaging, and offensive way. In a way, this hidden meaning re-emerges every time we hear Iago or Rodrigo mention his name. This insulting reference displays the surface level of racism in the play, a subconscious factor that changed the mindsets of the characters. Compared to modern-day societies where mistreatments based on race are still very common and movements centered around racial equity can be seen every day, Othello was the first piece of English-based literature that featured a person of color not only in a neutral/positive light, but to show the audience what they can accomplish. Now you may ask, how does this relate to Othello being a racist play, but instead a play focused on discussing the issue of racism in a given society? Well, we can clearly see here through Othello even though Othello eventually falls victim to Iago's masterful manipulation, he was originally a highly credited military general. Even Iago begrudgingly admits that another of Othello's fathom, Venice, has none, telling us of his military strength. And we also hear about the stories of Othello's life from year to year, the battles, sieges, fortunes that he has passed, the quote-unquote blackness of his soul, of his personality. Does not make him any less of a human, does not make him any less of a man than any other Venetian. We were supposed to have Professor Leah S. Marcus from Vanderbilt University joining us here, but as I mentioned before, she was unable to be here, so she sent an excerpt from her article, The Two Texts of Othello and Early Modern Constructions of Race. I quote, "What Othello does is enact a process by which skin color comes to be associated even by Othello himself with innate differences that demand his subordination or exclusion. On this view, the play is a powerful laboratory in which many of the stereotypical racial attitudes were able to dominate the culture later are allowed to coalesce. Marcus's term laboratory here implies a level of experimentation and uncertainty. In no literary work before has the problem of racism been highlighted to this degree. The play forces its consumers to look at Othello, his Moorship, and then reconsider how they're looking at him. And us at Literaturia hope you too will look after our program and think about this after our program and think about how every part of the story contributes to highlighting and spotlighting the issue of racism in a society. Now that we've covered the basics of the argument, let's dive a little deeper into Othello's identity, both how it's been shaped by the people around him and from society's own views. As we go through the play, we start to see that Othello changes, as characters usually do. But we also see exactly what he sees his own identity as. Othello tries hard to obliterate the obstacle of being a person of color in order to prove himself as a just, subjective, and honest man. However, he is aware of the systemic racism that still exists in some people around him, therefore he doesn't point out his skin color when attempting a rebuttal, but rather describes his life. For example, when Othello is brought before the Duke for questioning about Desdemona, he describes how he won over Desdemona with his stories. We see that the Duke actually remarks, "I think this tale would win my daughter too," acknowledging that Othello's accomplishments and progressions from a slave to a general make them more attractive without the aid of witchcraft or enchantments. By recognizing the way that some may treat him based on his skin color, Othello ensures that his race is not the only determining factor he has, and possesses a unique drive to progress further and further. The people around Othello have mixed feelings about race, while some are very willing to overlook it as his character, as Desdemona does, but there are others who blame their shortcomings as the fellow's fault, and his quote-unquote blackness makes him an inferior being. The late Millicent Bell, professor of the English Emerita at Boston University, stated, and I quote from her work Shakespeare's Moor, "Someone like the stupid Rodrigo, who has failed to get Desdemona even to glance at him, will refer to the gross clasp of the less vicious Moor when he attempts to arouse Brabantio against Othello. Iago works his vein when he portrays Othello as someone more impulsive." At the beginning of the play, we see Iago refer to Othello as his Moorship and the Moor, but Rodrigo was actually the first, with his thick-lipped statement, to show us the difference between Othello and their racist Venetians from a racial perspective. Iago then responds to Rodrigo saying that these Moors are changeable in their wills. Now, dear listeners, you may ask something along the lines of, and I quote, "Perhaps the same promptness to such presumption has infected the minds of some of the play's readers ever since, despite Shakespeare's exposure of the motives of Iago and Rodrigo in seizing so readily upon the ancient stereotype of the lusty Moor, right?" This is an amazing question, and this directly connects to our topic today. If it were true that Shakespeare's words would have a negative influence on the readers, this would be a play that promotes racial discrimination, a racist play. However, this is not the case at all. Let's take a look at another example. Even though we know Iago is the primary antagonist, later when he's alone he admits, "The Moor, howbeit that I endure him not, is of a constant loving noble nature." This is one of the many examples that promote Othello as a good and honest man, and one who must not be judged based on simply his physical appearance. Perhaps Othello's physical identity does not impact his ability to strive for social acceptance, but we can still see that Shakespeare, through Othello's race, presents identity as something that can be shaped and influenced by others, but at the same time, something that one can grab the reins on and take control over. Now, of course, this is not enough to really prove that it's a play about race. To truly discuss this question, other than what we have done to cover racism back in those times and Othello's identity, we also need to discuss the play as a whole, how Shakespeare wrote this masterpiece as well as how it's seen by a modern audience. Regardless of where Shakespeare wrote, regardless of where his plays were set, he always tried to reflect on what was happening in London at the time. It is a popular theory that the inspiration for Othello came from the visit of Abd al-Oid ben Masoud, a Moroccan secretary who visited Queen Elizabeth I 6 months before Othello started writing Othello. London was a very xenophobic place at the time, and while Shakespeare accurately depicted this aspect, he also commented on the personal and political atmosphere that he saw. Masoud was one of the Moors that was highly accepted by the people of London, as someone who not only served in Elizabeth's court, but also as someone who established great commercial relationships with Morocco. In order for these stories to influence modern society, they must be portrayed in a way that attempts to create the influence. They must be made to influence the listeners. But that's not the case here. When you look at Othello through the modern lens of our society, you can see that the governments that hold on to power still exist. The problems that create inequity still exist. And systems that inspire segregation and discrimination are still here. The major difference is that back then, they were not aware of these problems. They were not aware of racism being such an important matter. They did not think of it as a moral flaw to dehumanize others, to see them as inferior because of their skin color or physical appearance. Now we realize the problems that racism brings, problems that pose giant obstacles to society. They raise communities and obliterate relationships. This is taken into consideration when new Othello media is being produced. And anyone and everyone who consumes these media is subconsciously aware of racism as a crucial factor in this classic play. Literaturia listeners, you know we like to leave you all with something to think about. And we have discussed so much today. Any one topic can inspire hours of endless debate. However, I ask you to think on this, our main core topic that we have. Is Othello a racist play or a play about race? On our side, we believe that based on the systems of racism that existed at the time, based on some analysis into Othello's identity and how society sees him as a whole, as well as looking into the play itself as a form of media, Othello is not a racist story that promotes discrimination or racial hate, but instead it is one that sheds light on the dark streak of human history, showing us the dangers of hating our brothers and sisters solely because of their physical appearance and race. We must all strive to keep racism in check and learn to be open and accepting to all those around us. You're allowed to have your own opinions, but just learn to be open, learn to be accepting. The Moorish African Americans are just one example of discrimination and segregation. Asians, Native Americans, some Europeans even, are all at times under attack from other races. Instead of trying to get them to assimilate themselves into our society by spreading hate on their culture, we need to accept their differences. And as the old saying goes, don't judge a book by its cover. This is all the time that we have for you today, ladies and gentlemen. I'm truly thankful for everyone tuning into this amazing session that we've had and all the things that we talked about. And I bid you all adieu.